Hey everyone, welcome back to the Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today to have Kyle Alander from Christian Idealism. No more red background, but we do have a red chair. We're talking about how theism makes predictions today. So Kyle, what's up, man? How are you?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So what we're going to talk about today is theism and how it's going to make predictions. Which I mean, if true, it's a big win for the theism side because a lot of people will be especially on the atheist side, will say, theism doesn't make predictions. There's no explanatory power. Da da da. So yeah, Kyle, do you want to talk a little bit? Just introduce yourself in case people don't know who you are and what's going on today.
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Alander. As you all know, I've been on this channel multiple times. Christian Idealism. I run a YouTube channel. My main focus, at least right now, is actually the philosophy of religion. So I'm kind of away from philosophy of mind. I'm working on a huge project, which is my own case for theism, and a lot of the stuff we're going to discuss today is going to be a part of that project. So there's a lot of new stuff I have to present here. I'm going to talk about, and hopefully people will appreciate it on both sides.
Well, I'd encourage people to subscribe to your channel, Kyle, because I think it's great because you're kind of in that Swinburnian-ish kind of style of things. So it's a
Yeah.
good take when you combine that and idealism and all that fun stuff.
Yep.
So let's just start with this. We're going to talk about how theism makes predictions and where's the best place to start this, Kyle, when we're kind of trying to frame this.
Right. So when we're a few works I would recommend to get the basic idea is actually Swinburne himself. He makes this point. So one of the things is Swinburne in his book, The Existence of God. It's, I believe, chapter 6, where he goes into the explanatory power of theism and what people don't really understand what he's doing there. So I see a lot of atheists, try to argue against what he has to say in there, but what he's really doing when you get down to it is basically this idea of axiology. And basically it comes down to this idea that God's motivations to do things is based on his goodness, not his power. Because I see this get confused a lot, right? So when we're saying that God does an action, what we're saying is that it has to be a good action, right? And if it's a good action, then it's not the case that God can just do whatever he wants or that we can't make any kind of predictions. I'll get more to predictions in a moment because there is another way you could look at this, but at least when it comes to theism, at least thinking about what we can expect God to do, right? People will say, oh, we can't know anything about what God would do, right? And I would disagree with that. I think there are things there are, let's say, principles we can employ to sort of give us some kind of expectation or some kind of what I would say an epistemic probability to what God would do, right? And this is when I'm talking about God here, I'm referring more generally to just bare theism. So I'm not talking Christian theism or any other type of theism. I'm just talking just from the concept of God. It's just entailed that God would do good things. And if that's the case, which I think it is, I think that's just entailed from definition, then that's how theism makes its predictions. Now, that's the first aspect, of course, and people, that's not the only that's not where the theist has to stop. Where the theist has to go to then is what's called an axiology or some kind of value system, or let's say a decision theoretic framework by which God actually makes his decisions by, right? If that makes sense. And that's going to be based on some kind of axiological framework, right? So one of the caveats of this is that people can disagree about the axiological framework, of course, but it's just false to say that theism doesn't make predictions just because God, they talk about God. If God is omnipotent, then there's an infinite number of ways he could have done something. But because he only chose this particular action, then therefore we can't really say if there's a probability, right? And that's just completely wrong because of this idea of axiology. And how God actually makes his decisions. So really, I guess the basic point here is, if you want to understand how theism makes predictions, you have to really get down to God's goodness and his love, not his power, if that makes sense. So yeah, God might have the ability to do something. That doesn't mean, like, we're not talking about his abilities, we're talking about his motivations, and his motivations are going to be based on just his goodness. So that's the broad thing of it, if that makes
So
sense.
long story short, when we're going to talk about like why theism like can make predictions, we're not looking at like the omnipotence of God, where it's like, oh, God can do anything. It's like we have no clue like what's going to happen here, or, like what God would do. But rather, like you talked about, and like what Swinburne does is say, hey, we're going to look at God's perfection, and from God's perfection, we're going to be able to make these predictions, and that's kind of how theism is going to make predictions and explain things in the world.
Yeah, and another thing I want to mention here before we continue is actually a quote from Trent Dowdery on this. So I'm just going to give you guys the full quote so you can understand where he's coming from. So he says, theism's sole axiom is that there exists a person, a certain kind of person, a rational agent, a being with a mind and will, whose mind comprehends all truths and whose will is perfectly effective and unhindered by any outside force. Here are some further assumptions to which it will help without defense. First, I assume that facts about what constitute right action and right reasoning are necessary truths. Second, I assume that when an object is conceived of as good, it automatically gives the agent who grasps it such a reason to pursue it. Thus, states of affairs are, at their most general level, expected to the extent that they are good states of affairs, that they realize some kind of value, and the higher the value, the higher the expectation. Of course, there will be larger, infinitely many of ways of realizing the highest goods. There will likely be a very high goods and exemplification of which in a world is not possible. So no particular way of realizing them will have any antecedently high mathematical probability. But we are not trying to predict in advance which goods will be realized in which ways. We are retrodicting, asking ourselves what makes sense of what we take to be the case. When doing this, what makes it not so much which tokens occur, but rather which types are tokened. Given that God is a rational agent, we expect the best kinds of values to be tokened. And of course, for this means to serve ends well, we want the goods to be brought about in the most fitting way. So I know there's a lot there, but to summarize the quote there, what he's basically saying is, number one, we're assuming that these axiological truths that God is motivated by are necessary truths. And number two, that when we see an object as good, then it automatically gives God some kind of reason to pursue it, right? And then, of course, the third point that he made in there is just the general idea that of what's called retrodiction. And this idea of retrodiction is pretty much what we do in science all the time. So we don't have to predict in advance what will occur, but rather we look back on the history of our world and we say, okay, well, this is expected for my theory, even if my theory was formed after the fact, right? We could still like have this retrodictive, what's called retroductive inference. And we do that in science all the time. This idea, in fact, this idea of predictivism, this idea that theories that only predict things ahead of time are, more epistemically probable, is actually a view in the philosophy of science called predictivism. And Swinburne himself has critiqued this view. I'm not going to get into criticism of that view here, but I just want people to realize, like, when we're talking about God, when we're talking about theism making predictions, what we're really saying is theism retrodicting, if that makes sense. And of course, as I mentioned before, scientific views, theories, or whatever do this all the time, so it's not an issue, right? So I hope that sort of helps people understand what we mean when we say that theism makes predictions. What we're really saying is that theism is retrodicting. So yeah.
So if I understand you right, Kyle, because I want to like really help people who are listening kind of understand this, because the big claim we're making today is like theism makes predictions, and that's gonna like provide like strong evidence for God. The reason that theism makes predictions is, in a broad stroke, we're thinking about God and God being like a perfect being, and we're thinking about like, well, if there is a perfect being, like what are the consequences that there would be as a result of there being a perfect being? in the world. You can look at things like design or beauty or like
Right.
like moral agents, and these are things that if there is a perfect being, it'd be more likely if there is a perfect being than not, and that's how we're gonna get like this like evidence for theism, or like it makes predictions that there would be these things.
Yeah. So, I mean, atheists do this all the time with the argument from evil, right? So they say there's evil in the world. We would expect this on theism, right? Given that God is all good, he would prevent suffering or whatever. They, put in some principle or moral constraint on God and say, well, God violated this moral constraint, therefore God can't be all good. Well, you can do that as an argument, right? But the moment you do that, you're automatically going to assume some kind of value system to judge God's actions by. So the axiology is sort of like the data itself, if that makes sense. And then, from there, then you could so I guess the idea is with theism, you kind of have to have these auxiliary, I would say, assumptions. And these auxiliary assumptions are going to be axiological principles in the background to sort of guide God's actions, right? And I mean, there's even been a few atheist philosophers that have proposed this. So one of them is Gregory Dawes. He puts I forgot exactly what it's called, but he puts like a rationality principle on God, right? So it's not like only theists are the ones that are trying to do this. You also have atheists that also want to do this. Now, of course, Gregory Dawes argues against theism, and he says that God violates that principle, but it is what it is. The point here is like there are ways you can show that theism can be tested in that sort of way, even if it's not like some empirical test or some experiment or whatever. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'd love to start to like dive a little deeper now, because I feel like for people listening, like you kind of have like the big idea of like here's how theism makes predictions, and now we want to think about like what exactly is that gonna mean. So one of the things that you talked about with me is like that like it's gonna depend like first like if we're looking at like value systems. So like what is a value system, and then like what role is that gonna play in like theism making predictions?
Right. So a value system is basically just an axiology, or let's say a value theory, or whatever you want to call it. Right. So, and this is going to be part of the background knowledge that both sides have to assume. So both sides have to assume this value system. And of course, especially when it comes to arguments from evil, they also have to assume the same value system. Right. So if you're going to make any kind of judgments upon what God can't and can't do on a particular world, that is going to assume some kind of value system. Now, of course, there are different ways you can look at it. So there are some theists that out there that don't think that God has any obligations, right? I don't agree with that. So I would say that God does have moral or aesthetic obligations to his creatures if he makes them. And I have this general principle I'll get into later on this, um, but yeah, that's basically what a value system is. It's basically a set of principles or a set of necessary truths that God is motivated by to create, right? It doesn't have to be specific because, again, if we're talking about types of worlds rather than token worlds, then it's going to be there's going to be a little bit more freedom, at least in respect to what God can do when it comes to what he's motivated by. Now, of course, I know some people are going to say, oh, well, Kyle, you're psychoanalyzing God, right? You're trying to get into the mind of God. We can't understand the mind of God. In some sense, I agree. I don't think we can understand the mind of God fully. Even when we're in heaven, I don't think we can understand the mind of God fully, right? That's not what I'm claiming. What I'm claiming is that we can have some kind of we could put some kind of epistemic probability to what God would do or God's actions would do, even if we don't know the exact details, if that makes sense. So I just want to, put that out there. But if you want, I can get to the more detailed value system that at least that I work with. If you want to get into it, Zach.
Well, yeah, I think that's a great start. And I'd love to get into your value system here in a sec. But like what you're trying to say is like when we're starting off with like making these like how theism makes predictions, we talk big picture about it's going to come from God's goodness, and this value system is going to help us understand like what does it mean for God to be good, and that's going to help us get
Right.
rolling
So
here.
it's gonna really come down to God's motivation. So what is it within God's, let's say, decision framework that why would he choose one option over another, and it's going to be based in terms of goodness. And another thing is, when God is looking at this, he's not looking at it in terms of tokens. I mean, I guess he could, but I mean, in that case, then you would have an infinite number, right? But rather, he's looking at it in terms of types. If that makes sense. So
So his
types of
motivations come from his goodness.
right. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. Now, at least in regards to the principles involved, so there are a few principles that I do want to lay out for people. So the first one is what's called the diffusion principle. And the diffusion principle is kind of independent of theism, but again, if we're talking about necessary axiological truths, then this is kind of what, on the condition that theism is true, this is kind of what would be the case. So the diffusion principle is basically that goodness is diffusive of itself, that goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. Hence, the good being, or let's say God, will inevitably bring about other good things. So this is a general principle that God has to create, in the sense of it's just the epicenter probability that God creates is 1. It doesn't mean it's necessary, so it's not a metaphysical necessity, but rather it just means that God has to ground other good things to exist. Now, the second principle, you have any questions on that principle?
So God has to. I think people get hung up with, like, you're saying it's not epistemically necessary, but like where it is,
It's
but
not
then God,
metaphysically necessary. Yeah, but it's the epicenter probability is 1 in this case.
So how can there be an epistemic like probability of 1, like meaning like it's gonna happen no matter what, it's gonna happen, and then it not be like metaphysically necessary?
So it has to be, well, it has to do with this idea of whether God himself is metaphysically necessary, and I leave that option open, if that makes sense. And another thing is, like, with this principle, it just says that God has to ground good things. It doesn't say anything about what specifically that would be. So in that sense, then any world that God creates is not necessary. It's just that it's necessary that God creates some world, even if there's some, because I do think there is a problem. Like, for example, I don't think that the existence of our world is epicenter probability 1, because we're a token among a type. So that's the important part, is that our world, because our world is a token of a type, it's the type that would be epistemically, the epicenter probability of 1, but we observe ourselves in a token, and so because of that, we ourselves are not going to be an epicenter probability 1 on theism, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand where I'm going here?
Yeah, so it's like the type of world God creates is up in the air to some sense. Like, he didn't have to create our world; he could have created a different world. But like that, God's gonna do something, like that's something that was gonna happen. That he's gonna
So
do.
basically, the token of our world, so our specific world, is up in the air in the sense that there is a non-1 probability that God would create us, which basically means that there's it's not 100% probable that God would create us. But when we're talking about a type, so a world that God creates, because again, if we're viewing types as God creates, God doesn't create, the type of God creating is always going to be 1, but the actual token, so like what specifically is God going to create, that's not going to be 1. That's going to be there's going to be some kind of probability to it that's below 100%, if that makes sense. So that's why it avoids the necessitarianism, because we're not saying that our world specifically is necessary, just that there's just that within the epistemically possible spaces of worlds that God can create, we find ourselves in one of them, even if it's necessary. So think of it like this, okay? Let's say you have let's say you're playing darts and the dart board is infinitely big. Okay. Now, the probability that you're going to land on one specific point of that is actually extremely low, right? But the probability that you will hit the dartboard is 100%. It's guaranteed. Even if you throw the dart, and the moment it hits it, even if it's like, very, very, very small, that you're going to hit one specific part of it, you're still going to hit a part of it, even if the probability is 100% that you will hit the dartboard, right? If we're talking about an infinite dartboard. So that's the thought experiment that I like to always sort of use, because it also gets around the objection, like, oh, well, if God is omnipotent, then like, the probability that God would create our world is basically zero, because you have this infinite number of ways that God could have done it otherwise. Well, that thought experiment basically, pretty much undermines or completely, undermines that kind of argument. So yeah, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're thinking like God's gonna do something. Like he's gonna
Yeah.
create something. What he's gonna do is we don't know. There's a lot of options here, but like God is going to do something.
Right. Yeah, that's basically, at least that's entailed from the diffusion principle. Now, there are some other principles that I think narrow down what that's gonna, what type of
Yeah.
world. But yeah, that's so basically what the diffusion principle does. It shows that there's 100% probability that God will create, but that doesn't mean that God will create our specific world, right, with our
Hmm.
specific properties and all that stuff. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful. So I think we've kind of like looked at value systems as like what they are. Like
Yeah.
they're sort of like these necessary like moral truths. Do you want to dive into a little bit of like your value system and how that's gonna help like play into what's going on?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the diffusion principle. Another principle would be what's called the principle of plenitude. So basically, this principle just says, let me see if I can find my notes on this. Okay. Okay. So that if the hold on a sec. Okay, plenitude principle. So we can say that God brought about things into existence in order to communicate his goodness to creatures and to represent his goodness through them. So God's goodness or God's nature is reflected in creation. However, God's goodness cannot be adequately represented in any one creature or any one thing in creation, but rather God would create many diverse creatures and many diverse good things. That way, whatever was lacking in one's representation of the divine goodness in one creature or one thing may be supplemented by another. For the goodness that exists in a simple, uniform way that exists, so within God, you have just simple and pure goodness. Whereas in creation, you have a multiplicity of goodness. And the multiplicity of goodness sort of like is a reflection of God's own nature. So that's basically what the principle of plenitude is saying, that you're not going to find. So if God creates a world, so this is kind of, think of the diffusion principle, and then let's narrow it down a little bit. So if God creates a world, there's an epistemic probability of one that he will create, but there's also an epistemically probable 1% that whatever God creates will sort of that there's going to be a plenitude of things. Now, that
Mm-hmm.
leaves open upon what that will look like, right?
Yeah.
That's going to leave open on what is a world going to look like if we say that God is going to create a plenitude of things. But there's still, at least antecedently, that the antecedent probability that God would create a multiplicity of things is one. So it is sort of narrowing down the principle. So, like, for example, we can rule out worlds where God only creates one kind of thing or one kind of goodness, right? So, for example, saying that God would create a world in which there's only one particle, I think we can rule that out just by this principle. So, just by the fact that if God did create a world with only one particle in it, well, that's not going to really reflect fully what God's nature is. Whereas in our kind of world, it's a little bit different. So in our world, we actually have moral agents. We have, a universe, a beautiful universe. We also, well, I'll get more into the different categories of value in a moment, but I hope you understand what I'm saying here. That when we're talking about the principle of plenitude, we're talking just the idea that there's going to be different categories of value that God will actualize, and like each one is going to sort of represent a different aspect of God's nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do have, so I guess the three categories of value in this case would be aesthetic goodness, alethic goodness, and then moral goodness. So these are the three categories. So, like, for example, fine tuning might fit within the aesthetic, and then moral agents like us is going to fit, of course, into the moral. And then some kind of argument, like from the applicability of mathematics or whatever. I'm not saying that theists have to accept that argument, but that's just one example where, like, maybe some alethic argument for theism might go through or something. Or maybe the gnomic argument for theism, the argument that the laws of nature are explained by theism better than naturalism, might fit also within that category. Or maybe it could fit in both categories of alethic and aesthetic, right? Because it's not really a moral thing, right? So yeah, so that's the basic idea, at least behind the plenitude principle, that if God creates, that God would create a multiplicity of things rather than just one particular kind of goodness. So yeah.
So you're looking at the idea then it's like God is going to create a world where it's just like me and Kyle. Like that's not enough. Like he's looking at like different kinds of goodness. Like if he's going to create, like he's going to create a universe that has like aesthetic goods and moral goods. It's going to be full of all kinds of different like good things within the universe.
Yeah, so that kind of gets around a lot of objections to fine tuning. Like, for example, the electrons in love objection, where God only creates electrons that sort of fire and whatever. Well, that's not gonna actually, that kind of world is not gonna give you something like a moral. That's not gonna give you moral goodness, right? And it's also not gonna give you aesthetic, or not. It would actually give you aesthetic goodness, but it's not gonna give you something like alethic goodness, right? So
yeah,
there is this kind of weird scenario where, like, if you apply this value system to arguments against certain arguments for theism, like fine tuning, this would actually completely undermine those objections entirely because it goes by the wrong value system, right? So it definitely does help the theist in this case, because not only can you use a variety of different arguments for theism and show, like, hey, there's a multiplicity of ways that theism can make predictions, but also it can sort of protect against potential objections to these arguments as well. So yeah, so that's my second principle, and I do have one more, but I don't. Do you have any questions about the plenitude principle?
I think that's good. We've looked at the different kinds of goods. Yeah.
Okay, so the last one is actually I'm not saying this to get clicks. I'm not saying this to get views or, like, but I literally, this X principle I'm going to go over, I literally came up with it last night. Like, literally, I didn't come up with, like, when we first scheduled to have this talk, I didn't even have this principle yet. So I literally came up with this last night. So I'm still playing around with it, but I do think it works. So the final principle is what I call the ultimate goodness, and the definition, I haven't formally. Sorry, did I break up?
You broke up there for a sec, but I think
Okay.
you're good now, Kyle. So go ahead.
Okay, so this is what the ultimate goodness principle says. For any E can be instantiated by God if at some time T, E bears the axiological status of being good on the whole. Okay. And what that basically means is that any world that God creates, or any creature that God creates, that at some time it obtain the axiological status of being good on the whole, which basically means that all of its imperfections and, all of what it was meant to be is fully realized, if that makes sense. Now, informally, this is my informal definition, would say that anything God creates or grounds must be ultimately good on the whole. Now, that basically just means the same thing. So good, when we talk about ultimate goodness, we're just talking about good on the whole, right? So I would say that this principle puts a constraint on God's action, since we, if we're talking about theism making predictions, we need a way to separate out states of affairs that are antecedently expected on theism from ones that are not antecedently expected on theism, right? And so the principle of ultimate goodness would sort of antecedently, or it would put a constraint on what's called the antecedent probability of theism. So basically, any world that God creates must be, at some point in that world must reach the axiological status of being good on the whole, right? And I believe that this principle actually fully encapsulates what I've discussed before in this channel, which is like, talking about the defeat condition and like evil eventually being defeated and all that stuff. So it puts the antecedent probability of theism in that sort of line of reasoning. So basically, it's just entailed from theism that you would get some kind of like defeat condition as another kind of moral constraint of God, at least when we conditionalize evil. So I just want to be clear here that when we're talking about the ultimate goodness principle and the defeat principle, the defeat principle is just, it's conditionalized upon evil, whereas the ultimate goodness principle is just the antecedent probability, so the antecedent principle that we're using to sort of constrain God's actions, right? So I just want to make that clear, because some people will like object, oh, well, don't you have to, wouldn't you have to conditionalize upon evil? And it's like, well, no, not in this case. I mean, yeah, when it comes to the defeat principle, then yeah, you would have to conditionalize on evil, right? But when it comes to the antecedent probability, right, independently of evil, then we would use this, what's called the ultimate goodness principle. And so when you have these three principles, so you have the diffusiveness principle, the principle of plenitude, and the ultimate goodness principle, then that is those three principles are going to be in the antecedent probability range of what we can expect God to do. So, of course, the diffusion principle just says that God has to create a world. It doesn't have to be a specific world. Number two is the principle of plenitude. And as I stated before, this basically means that there has to be a multiplicity of things that God creates. So there has to be aesthetic goods, there has to be alethic goods and moral goods. And then finally, the ultimate goodness principle, which basically is another constraint on God, which basically says that for any entity that God creates, that at some time, so it can be any time, it could be right after they're created or some time later down the line, that this entity or creature bears some kind of axiological status of being good on the whole, right? So this can be applied to a moral agent, but this can also be applied to the universe as a whole, right? So when we're saying like, for example, when we're saying that the universe is sort of growing and becoming better over time or evolving over time, well, I think that's expected on theism. That's expected that you would have this kind of that eventually the universe will gain the axiological status of being good on the whole, right? At least aesthetically, right? And it might not be a moral good, but it's going to be aesthetic good, because again, if we're also using the plenitude principle, then there has to be these different categories of value as well. So that's basically my value system in a nutshell. Now there are some other I would say other principles that we can go over, but at least when it comes to constraining God's goodness, those are going to be the principles that I'm going to be working by. And like, that's how my type of theism would make its predictions, if that makes sense.
So we're looking, and the predictions are going to come when we're looking at a universe that is like good on its whole. And if we can see that, like, that's going to be some like conformatory evidence like towards theism.
Right. Yeah. And it also, I think, yeah. And another, I guess, one last thing in regards to that is like, I think this also has implications for arguments from evil, because a lot of the times people will say, oh, well, the antecedent probability of theism on evil is low, right, because of this, or because of some other principle that they say, oh, well, God must prevent harm, or, they have some kind of other, like, I know Gregory Dawes says something like that God must prevent suffering or something like that. God would reduce suffering, right? So what this principle does is it sort of shows, or it's an alternative principle. So it says that basically that for any world that God creates or any creature that God creates, that creature must at some time reach the axiological status of being good on the whole. And the thing with that is there's nothing in our world that really violates that principle, because antecedently on theism, all it's saying is that at some time that creatures would gain that axiological status to begin on the whole. It doesn't say that it has to be right now or in this life or, whatever, right? If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's super helpful. So thanks for that, Kyle. So I'd love to start to look at like how is theism then going to start to depend on a value system? Like, so we have these value systems that we talked about, and you talked about a couple different principles. Like, how is theism going to like depend on that?
Right. So the reason it's very simple. So you look at the hypothesis of theism. Theism says that God is all good. If God is all good, then he must be guided by moral principles, or there must be some kind of end by which God is acting by, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, then the axiology, your value system, is going to dictate what God is motivated to do, right? And it's again, when it comes to the theism and naturalism debate, it has to be part of the background knowledge, because naturalists, in order for them to make an internal critique of theism, so like some argument from evil, whatever, they have to use that same axiology. So they have to. So basically, what you could say, and I would agree with this, is that the axiology determines what the antecedent probability of theism would be, or what we can expect God to do, right? Given his goodness. So it's just flowed from the nature of God that he would sort of do these kind of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So yeah. Let me see. I guess what you could say is this is gonna. I think I forgot which philosopher came up with this term, but you could say that God is the truth, the good, and the beautiful. And so because of that, then sorry, I don't know why they're printing out. Oh man, this is not what
It's printing out right there.
Yeah, I'm not doing this, so it's probably my grandparents printing this stuff out. I don't know why. But
nice little like halfway through the interview, like printing eruption break or something like that.
But I hope you understand where I'm coming from. So basically that is this the same freaking Yeah. I don't know how much longer this is gonna go by.
Well, I mean, I have one question for you.
Yeah.
It's something maybe to think about as you keep gathering things that are printing. And I think people would be wondering. So we started off talking about like these value principles, and like, they're gonna help make predictions. But some people may wonder, like, well, are these the things that like is God like subservient to these value principles? Like, how do they relate directly to God? Because it seems like you're like putting these principles, like God must do this, God must do this. Is there something like above God telling God what to do? Like that's obviously as a Christian, like you wouldn't really want to affirm that.
Yeah. So the idea of this. Okay, I gotta stop this. Hold on, let me turn off. Okay, I'll just. I think it stopped now. Okay. So, the question was, I believe the question that you asked was,
thinking about like how does God relate to these like moral principles you talked about?
So it's just entailed. So it's just entailed from the fact that God is all. So again, it's part of the hypothesis that God is all good, right? So if God is all good on that condition, then it's just entailed that God would be motivated. And this is kind of what Swinburne also views it as, where these axiological principles are necessary truths, and God will be kind of moved by them, right, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it's not like God is like, oh, well, these principles constrain what I do, therefore I can't do it. It's more of, this is just part of God's nature to, be kind of guided by these principles, right? Now, another thing is, I also want to mention that these principles don't say that like God has to create a specific token world, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like in that case, then I don't think the objection really holds, because God still has the freedom to create. When he wants to fulfill these principles, there's a lot of freedom in God to what he can do in terms of um, the token world that he creates. But when it comes to the type of world, I think that's going to be where you have to kind of like narrow down what God is going to do, right? So the probability that God would create a world is one, even if like our specific world is not one. The probability that he's going to create a world with a multiplicity of beings is also one. Again, even if we ourselves find ourselves in a different kind. So like there might be a world where you have like a different set of multiplicity of things or whatever, but it's still going to be more probable, right? And this has to also go back to the retrodiction idea that I mentioned earlier. And then of course the ultimate goodness principle would be just that for any world that God creates, that you would have, that creature would eventually reach the status of getting the status of good on the whole, right? So it's not something that it's not. So there, I think there is still freedom in God and what He can do, but because of God's goodness, that's going to automatically just constrain what He can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think theist I think if theism wants to have explanatory power, it kind of has to do that, right? There has to be some kind of constraints on God, if that makes sense. Of course, in this case, God's constraints are going to be this kind of axiological landscape, right? So yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like these principles like are like telling God what to do, but rather these principles kind of come from the nature of God, and from that we're gonna be able to like make these predictions.
Right. Yeah. Pretty much. So
is there anything else you want to say, Kyle, about like how theism like depends on a value system, or do you want to kind of look into like the prediction aspect now?
yeah, so let's go into like the prediction aspect.
Yeah, before you
So
do, I
yeah.
just want to paint the picture for people. So in the beginning, we kind of like give a brief sketch, and then we talked like we did a lot of work talking about like value systems. So thinking about like a set of like necessary like moral truths, and you talked about like the value system you kind of like are putting forward here. We're like looking at things like God's going to create a diverse world with different kinds of goodness. It's going to be ultimately good and whatnot. And because of that, with that value system, theism can make these predictions. And theism depends on the value system because like God is good himself, and from that we're going to be able to get like these predictions and whatnot. Am
Right.
I
It kind of
am I
flows from the definition. Yeah. So
Okay, so then if there is a value system and like theism is going to kind of flow from that, like how does theism make predictions then?
right. So when it comes to that specific question, there's actually I'm sure you've had Tim Howard on before, invoking
Of
theism,
course.
and he himself has actually come up with this great thesis. I didn't really. He's the one that came up with this, so I give full credit to him. And it's basically what's called the axiological relevance thesis. So this is what it
Hmm.
says. For any observation, theism predicts the observation if a relation of axiological relevance connects propositions about theism to propositions about the observation. Um, so what this means is that you can have propositions that, or you can have propositions about the observation that could be aesthetic observations, that could be alethic observations, or they could be moral observations, right? But as long as there's or as long as there's some axiological relevance between the observation, um, yeah. So basically, as long as there's an axiological relevance between the observation and to what theism says about, it's about what theism's value system is, then that's automatically going to favor theism over naturalism, right? Because
Hmm.
naturalism is axiologically indifferent, right? There is no axiological relevance there, right? So because of that, well, I'm sure you've heard of arguments like, oh well, naturalism can parody theistic explanation. For example, you have the stalking horse objection against fine tuning, where basically, oh well, if God has motivation to do X, in this case fine tuning, then the naturalist can just say, oh well, there's a natural disposition towards X or fine tuning, right? So that there's a kind of like this parity explanation that you could present there, and the actual logical relevance these completely shows that to not be true, because God is going to be motivated by axiological relevance. So the connection between fine tuning. So if fine tuning is an aesthetic good, then that's going to fit within theism's value system. So it's just it flows from the nature of because again, if God is all good, he's going to do good things, and if good things are whatever the value system is, then it's just going to be that's just going to sort of flow from theism. Whereas on naturalism, natural dispositions are fundamentally indifferent, right? So they're not going to be connected. So indifference doesn't actually, you can't make a connection between indifference and some kind of natural disposition. It just doesn't exist there, right? And also the other thing is, the term natural is also axiologically indifferent, right? So because it's axiologically indifferent, then something like Graham Oppy's, parity method of like looking at theistic evidence is not going to work either on this kind of way of looking at things. So it completely bypasses all those issues. Because if God is motivated by goodness, then the evidence for theism is going to be in terms of axiological relevance. But naturalism cannot parody that, because naturalism is not guided by axiological relevance, right? So that's where theism gets the advantage from, in terms of the, how does theism actually predict these sort of things? So yeah.
Okay, so theism predicts these things, and if we're thinking about it, the way theism makes these predictions is it's going to flow from the nature of like who God is. So flowing from that value system, like it flows from that value system that like God is good, and like God would create good things. God would create a universe that's good in a whole. God would create a diverse universe. That's like doing the work here, is like it's coming from the goodness of God, and that's going to explain why these things are the way they are.
Right. Yeah. Basically.
Okay, and then the advantage comes over like atheism or naturalism, because there is no like base thing on atheism that would like explain like, oh, there would be like this good diverse world, or a world that's good on a whole, or things like that. And that's how theism's going to get this advantage over atheism.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, do you have? I have a bunch of like questions and like objections I want to throw at you. Anything else you want to say on like how theism's going to make predictions before we get into some of those?
No, that's fine. You can throw my well, if you do throw objections, I can probably clarify more on it anyways. So
yeah, definitely. So one thing that I'm sure like some atheist listeners might be thinking is like, well, what about like scientific predictions? Like, isn't that like the go-to? Like, we have an experiment, they can look under a microscope and be like, oh, look, there we go, there's our thing. Still can't like under this model look under a microscope and just like see God. So like, obviously, it's gonna be different from scientific predictions. And like, how's that gonna matter? Like, how would you like respond to someone that says like, this isn't like a good method of like prediction?
Right. So that's it depends on what you mean by prediction. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is this idea of retrodiction, and I think most scientific theories are actually retrodicting rather than predicting. But even setting that aside, I think, so I guess the question is, why can't we just, assume some type of scientific theory, right? But again, this isn't going to really answer the question, because if we go down that route, if we say, oh, well, the scientific theory explains it and we don't need anything else, well, that doesn't really explain the scientific theory itself, right? I mean, I know Swinburne has made this point before. Theism is not trying to replace science, but rather theism is trying to explain why we can do science in the first place, right? So yeah, that's what I would say in response to that objection. And also there's some really good, I think is this the book? I think I don't. Okay, so I'm probably okay. I might be wrong in this completely, but oh wait. So Andrew Loki himself, I think in the first chapter of this on his book on God and Ultimate Origins, has critiqued scientism. Now, I don't want to critique scientism fully here, but I would reference that first section to sort of understand a lot of the issues with even again, and this is his criticisms apply even if you don't think the Kalam works, because I don't think the Kalam works, not even his version. But what I will say is that I think he provides some good criticisms of scientism, at least in that first section. So I don't think that's going to work as an objection to the actual framework here.
So what you're gonna say, Kyle, then is one, like scientism is false. Like that idea that like you need to have these like experimental predictions. Like, no, we don't need that. In like the hard scientific like sense. So that's one response. And then the second thing you'd say is kind of like, well, theism does make predictions. It's just not in that way. Like there's a different way of doing it where like this whole method you laid out.
The other thing I would also want to mention here that at least in the realm of epistemology, there are multiple ways that you could realize evidence. So it's not like evidence is just limited to like, scientific evidence, but rather you can have multiplicity of evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can find my notes on this, because there actually is a definition of evidence that I think works and sort of encompasses all of our knowledge. So there's actually Thomas Kelly from the Princeton University makes, I think he wrote a paper on this, and let me see if I can get the paper just so I don't forget. So yeah, he wrote a paper on the nature of evidence, and his definition of evidence is basically that evidence is a function. So a central function of evidence is to make evident that which would not be so in its absence. Well, if that's your definition of evidence, that's not just limited to scientific evidence, right? So you can have, for example, you can have historical evidence, you can have evidence in terms of like when you're trying to solve a crime scene, right? You're not going to do an experiment there. You're going to rely upon, you're going to gather some sort of data and try to predict, try to create a story of what happened or something like that. So when we understand evidence properly, right, in the way that epistemologists talk about it, scientism is just wrong. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's super helpful. So you're gonna say scientism is wrong, and I think it might be helpful for people like when you're saying like theism makes predictions. Predictions like that word can carry a lot of baggage. So like what you're really trying to do is like show that like there is evidence for theism. When we're looking at this, like these things are like expected on theism, not atheism. There's going to be like big picture. This is evidence for theism. This may not
right.
Like,
not only that,
when
but
you mean
another
predictions,
thing.
it doesn't mean like it proves God exists. It just means like there's evidence for God.
Right, and so the other thing is when it comes to make theism make a prediction, I'm just saying that we can put an antecedent probability, that we can put some kind of principles that sort of limit God's actions, so then when we look out into the world, we can see, hey, this is more expected on theism than its negation, right? So that's all I'm really saying here. I'm not claiming that like this proves God or anything like that. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's super helpful. That you're saying like, hey, here's evidence for God. These are predictions that provide evidence. They don't prove God exists. Yeah, that's super helpful. So another thing I wondered, Kyle, is like, what kind of implications would this have for like skeptical theism? Like, if we're gonna say that like theism makes predictions, some people that are skeptical theists may like wonder like can you still like be a skeptical theist and like if say like maybe you can predict what God would do in like this front, but not with like evil. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So I do think that at least extreme skeptical theism is not going to work. So if we're going to say that we can't know anything about why God would allow or why God would create our world, that's just not going to work. Now, when it comes to evil specifically, I think there might be some room here, and let me sort of outline what I mean by this. So what we could say, and this is kind of the approach that I myself take. So the view of skeptical theism that I sort of adopt is sort of more moderate, and what it basically says is this: the antecedent probability that God would create a world. So again, I'm using the principle of ultimate goodness here. The antecedent probability that God would create a world that is good on the whole is 1. Okay, so that's antecedent. It's antecedently more likely on theism than its negation that God would do this. And then when we look out into the world, we have to observe, let's say, evils, for example. And what an atheist might say is, oh, well, look at all these evils. This is not good in the whole. This is not like defeated. This isn't the defeat condition, or this ultimate goodness condition hasn't been fulfilled. And then what the theist can say in response to that is, well, since theism entails an afterlife, so since theism entails that things would be good in the whole, then it would entail some kind of, afterlife where these evils can be defeated. And so then any indefeasible evils, so any evils that we observe that don't seem to be good on the whole, it's just inscrutable. So you can't actually put any kind of probability to it, right? So it's probabilistically inscrutable. So basically any evils that are indefeasible, or any evils that seem indefeasible or gratuitous or whatever, are probabilistically inscrutable given this, right? Given the antecedent probability judgment that we, the antecedent principles that we laid out earlier. And so therefore, it's skeptical theism in the sense that what we're saying is that it's inscrutable. The probability is inscrutable that you would see these indefeasible evils or gratuitous evils or whatever, right? And so then the probability just is nullified at that point because of the fact that we haven't observed an afterlife. We haven't observed the creature to be good on the whole yet, right? So because we haven't observed that, because we haven't observed there, and we also haven't, it works both ways. So we haven't observed their lives be good on the whole, but we also haven't seen a violation of that principle. So we haven't seen God actually violates the ultimate goodness principle. So because of that, then the probability is can't make a judgment on it, right? So in that sense, it's skeptical theism because is that the probability is inscrutable, right? And in order for the probability to work, you have to show that it's actually disconfirmatory, that there's actually like some positive, good reason to think that that there would be, that these types of evils are unexpected on theism. But when we have this principle, that's just not the case, right? It's inscrutable in that sense. So yeah, that's one way in which actually can be applied here. It's just a more kind of, it's more limiting. It's not saying that we can't know anything about why God allows for evil, or we can't know anything about why God created our world, but rather what it's saying is that the probability, so the probabilities of these inscrutable evils, or the probabilities of the this alleged disconfirmatory evidence, is actually not disconfirmatory, but rather it's inscrutable. So that's what I would say in response to that.
So what you are trying to do then, Kyle, if I understand you right, is when we're looking at skeptical theism, is you're trying to first like look at your defeat condition, where we have this idea that you can go back, and we did some conversation about this a while ago, where it's the idea that all evils are going to be defeated. And this is something that's like entailed from the nature of like God, a perfect being. So it's something that like if God exists and there's a perfectly good God, all evils are going to be defeated. It's something that's like gonna happen. Like it's not like it's gonna like it's entailed from God existing. Like this has to happen. And from there, then you kind of look at skeptical theism. And you want to say that like, well, if this defeat condition's entailed that all evils are gonna be defeated, and someone wants to look at like say like a horrendous evil that's gratuitous, you want to say like, hey, like it's actually inscrutable because like we can't really know and say that it's gratuitous because we know that it's entailed that God will defeat all evils, and maybe we're just missing something here, and there's some larger picture or something going on here where this evil is in fact going to be defeated because we have this entailment from theism. Is that kind of what you're trying to do?
Yes. Yeah. So in that sense, it is, this is my approach. This is kind of like my version of skeptical theism, where you could say that the probabilities are inscrutable, right? But again, notice how it's not skeptical theism in the sense where I can't know anything, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be what I would push back against that version of skeptical theism. But the view that I hold to, a more moderate version, I think works on my model. So yeah.
So I like this because you're not just saying like, and not all forms of skeptical theists do this, because I think I've been reading like the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil. I'm on the last section where it's Mike Ray talking about like answering these like super skeptical challenges, and he's like, hey, a lot of people like say skeptical theists believe stuff that they don't, because they're really focused on like the problem of evil and saying like, hey, we just don't know if an evil is gratuitous or not, and that's all we're saying. And you're trying to like almost say not just that, where it's like we don't know if an evil is gratuitous, like we're not in a position to know, but you're also trying to add on to say we know that evil is going to be defeated, and because of that, we can
If
be more
theism is
confident in
true,
like what we
so
don't know.
notice how on the condition that theism is true, it's entailed that evil will be defeated. So if that's the case, then the probability of their evil being defeated is the same probability as theism, which means that any observed indefeasible evil is going to be inscrutable because we haven't observed what their total life is. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, I really like that, and I think it's a better version of theism, in that sense. So yeah, that's great. So here's a question for you. This is going back to like epistemic probability and like metaphysical like probability. So if I remember you right, it's epistemically necessary that God creates, but it's not metaphysically necessary. Is that right?
I would, yes, and the reason why I say that is because if we say it's metaphysically necessary that God creates, then we have to refer specifically to our world. So the world that we observe is the one that God would create necessarily, right? Because that's necessitarianism, right? So necessitarianism would say that that it's our world specifically that is necessary, right? And so the reason why it's not metaphysical necessity is because of that fact that all we're saying is that God has to create. We're not saying that God had to create our token world, right? Our specific world, right? It could have been a different world or whatever, but yeah. So that's why there's that sort of distinction there.
Okay. So in your view then, Kyle, can you hear that wind?
I can.
Right here. Yeah, I'm on the East Coast, so we're going through that whole like tundra right now. So I was wondering, because I'm like, dang, it's happening out there right now. So anyways, back to the program. So in your view then, going way back before like God creates, there's no possible world then in your view where God just sits there and just doesn't create? Because I think traditionally Christians have said like, yeah, it's possible, just God never created anything. And are you saying there's no possible world where God just doesn't create anything?
So I would say, so obviously I think all Christians would agree that the Trinity is necessary, metaphysically necessary.
Yeah.
And that's what I would say as well. But what I would say is that there's no possible world in which God doesn't ground something good or doesn't create something beyond himself, if that makes sense. So we don't know, like, if there's some other possible world out there that's completely different than ours, right? Then it would seem to me to be the case that that would be now. I guess I would say no, that there is no possible world in which God doesn't create something, right? Given this diffusion principle and given the other principles I laid out. So so yeah.
So you're kind of fine just going into the like a Christian tradition here and say, yeah, it is impossible that like God just couldn't create, like or he wouldn't create.
Yeah, now the reason why I say that is because I don't see within God's motivations of why he wouldn't create. Like I just don't see where, like, what would be his motivation to not create at all. And I just don't really see what would be that motivation. So maybe it's just like a limitation on my part. I'm happy to be proven wrong, definitely, right? And I could certainly modify my principles to accommodate that. But from what I can see by my lights, I feel like no, like if God exists, it's just the epicent probability that God would create is 1, right? So that's what I would say.
Okay, so, and this is from the diffusion principle that you're kind of like making this stand here. Like
Yeah.
how can you just go over that again briefly? Like how is the diffusion principle making you believe that, or not making you, but leading you to believe that like there's no possible world where God doesn't create?
So yeah, so the idea is basically that goodness is diffusive of itself. That goodness must always actualize some state of affairs that is beyond itself,
Mm,
right? Um, so that's what I would say. That basically that goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. Um,
mm,
Now it's interesting because Thomas Aquinas actually does hold to this principle, but of course, what he would say, and Swinburne makes the same point, I think it was it Oh yeah, I think it was Swinburne, where basically like the Trinity is an example where you could have it where the Father grounds the Son and Spirit, and so that's kind of the so maybe there is a sense in which like okay, the diffusion principle can be fulfilled, um, even if God doesn't create like contingent creatures like us, right? Um, but I don't know. I'm still thinking through that, but I do think that the diffusion principle kind of epistemically entails with a probability of one that God would create.
okay.
Even creatures, yeah, even contingent creatures like us, even if it's beyond the Trinity, right? So yeah,
Okay, that's helpful, Kyle. So it's because God is good. His goodness is like almost he's gonna mean like he's going to create something else. Like he's not just gonna sit there by himself. Like he's gonna create these good things and like something along those lines is kind of the
yeah,
story that you're bringing forward.
yeah.
Okay, so how can here's another question. We spent a lot of time talking about your value system, and from there, like that's gonna be like how theism makes its predictions. So like some people may wonder, like, how can you really know that? Like that's God's desires. So going back to like people saying, like, well, is Kyle just psychoanalyzing God, knowing exactly like what God desires and wants and things like that? Like, how are you coming to this value system? That's doing a lot of the work here.
Right. So one of the things is a lot of some of the principles are kind of independent theism. So the diffusion principle is independent theism. The principle of plenitude is independent theism, and that's just because of the way that values are, right? So values, um, so you could say that the axiology of the value system is the higher order theory. It's our background knowledge by which theism is making its predictions off of. So this idea, did I?
I think it's on my
Okay.
end. It's on
Okay,
my end.
yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
was
turn my
wondering.
camera off for a minute. It's on my end. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I
All
can
right,
hear
I'm gonna
you.
just keep my camera off for a minute. But keep going. It's my end.
Yeah, okay, just making sure. So yeah, I mean, so the idea here, I think, and this has to do with my view of epicenter probability, which is basically that the way that theism makes its predictions is also based off its background knowledge, and this background knowledge is going to be based on the higher order theory, so a higher order axiological system. And when you combine this with what's called conformational holism in the philosophy of science, um, then the probability of theism is just going to be the same as the probability of this axiological or this value system, right? So that's sort of how um, you get to it, if that makes sense. And so, like, the axiological system is not going to be, I mean, yeah, it's going to be auxiliary in the sense that it's part of our background knowledge, but I mean, both sides have to do that anyway. So I don't really see why the theist can't do that. Otherwise, if you're going to deny, like, if you're a theist, if you're going to deny that God has this value system, then you can't make any predictions. And if you're an atheist, and if you deny this value system, then then you can't run arguments from evil. So both sides have to use it. And I think once we understand something like, conformational holism and background knowledge and how all that stuff works, then it's just kind of it's already a part of the system as it is. So
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I'm gonna try to turn my camera back on. Hopefully, the ruling everything's all right. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, Kyle. Is there anything else you want to cover? We covered all the like questions I wrote down as we were going. Anything else here before we start to wrap up?
um I don't think so. Okay. So one of the things that people need to understand when it comes to theism making predictions is this idea of conformational holism. Okay. Um, People will say, "Oh, well, aren't you just assuming, you know, an axiology here to like generate predictions from, and I'm saying no, because any scientific theory is going to have these kind of what's called or auxiliary hypotheses, or you could say background knowledge in the background that kind of constrains the theory,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you want more information on this, there's an article on the New World Encyclopedia about conformational holism and how it works. But yeah, that's what I would reference in terms of, if people think that, oh, well, you're assuming, like one example is that, oh, well, you're assuming this value system and that's going to lower your priors or something like that. But it's like, no, because my value system is independent of theism. It's just the background knowledge by which theism makes its predictions by. So it's not actually going to lower theism's priors at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say in response to that.
Okay. Kyle, this has been great. I don't really have anything else to say here. Yeah, anything else? I'll give you the floor. Just yeah.
Nope, just I guess I will be doing a video on this next year. I don't know. I don't have the exact date yet because I'm still writing the script, but this is kind of like my axiological system by which how I can show that theism makes predictions. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you. Yeah, it's been a great conversation, and I appreciate your work, and you're always willing to come on. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. How can people like follow with you, connect with you, things like that?
So yeah, go to Christian Idealism. You can also follow me on Twitter, Christian Idealism. You can email me at massapologist@gmail.com. So if you want to reach out to me there, you can as well.
All right. Well, this is it here on Apologetics, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today. If you're new here, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And if you value what we do, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Apologetics. That's that. Kyle, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate your time. All right. Have a good one, everyone. God bless, and we'll catch you next time.